All right. Well, hey, everybody, and welcome back to Theology Thursday. My name's Alex Hauser. I'm joined with Jackie Becker, is what your
Yes.
screen says there, Doug.
I don't know if I've discussed this before, but my daughter changed this, and I'm like an old man now with technology apparently. And I could change it on each call, but I don't know
There
if
you go.
anybody knows how to change it. Don't tell me to go to preferences because it's not in there. Unless it
Right.
is, and
So
I'm not
if
sure.
anybody knows how to change Doug's name on his Zoom account, you can email him at doug.becker@emergencenj.org.
Yes.
All right. So this week, Doug, we're tackling a challenging topic here a little bit, challenging in some regards. We're going to be taking a look at the issue of abortion and I guess, kind of how we should think about that as Christians, biblically and morally. And, just before we kind of get started here, we recognize that there's an unfortunate reality that abortion in and of itself has been tied to a political landscape. And Doug and I are not trying to make a political argument. We're not trying to sway you one way or the other. We're trying to talk about this issue as far as how we should look at that as people that love and follow Jesus. Is that fair to say, Doug?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's navigating morality is sometimes a bit of a juggling act because sometimes you've got, especially on things that are relevant politically, because you've got competing concerns that you might have. But I don't think the answer to that is being uninformed about moral issues. I think the answer to that is being more informed and thinking clearly and consistently, biblically as well as morally so. Of course, there's a lot of overlap between those, but yeah. So it was our thought to do this session just in light of some of the current cultural discussion. Of course, right now we're recording this as a new Supreme Court justice is being confirmed, and so this is entering into public discourse again. And
yeah, it's probably worth saying that it's Thursday, the 22nd of 2020, in case this ends up hanging out on the website for a while and you're watching this from the past.
Yeah. And speaking of hanging out on the website, the bulk of what I'm saying here, I have taught before. So I addressed this issue in a winter sessions from, I think it was 2018, maybe. So a lot of this is kind of rehashing that, but I know a lot of that, content can kind of get just buried in archives and things like that. So I think it's important to have this out there again.
Yeah. All right, Doug. So lead the way here, my friend. So we're talking about abortion, and I'm looking at our show notes here, and I even the first note here is the idea that this is an issue. It's a justice issue, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the idea here that compels me to talk about this is the fact that I think that from various different perspectives, we have to say that we live in a country right now in which the laws allow for extreme acts of violence against defenseless children. And that, for me, is the main issue, not only as a parent, but as a Christian, as somebody who tries to live by a law of love. If that is the case, I think that warrants serious moral reflection. And if we think that the laws should remain as they are, then I think we need to have a very good reason for doing that, because on the face of it, that is what this issue is about. Not only that, but not only is abortion for virtually any reason legal in our country, but it's also celebrated by a large part of our society. There have been, since the passing of Roe versus Wade in the early 70s, over 50 million children who have been aborted, and that's not counting abortifacient drugs. Those are medical procedures. So, even whatever side of the issue comes down on, clearly this is a morally serious issue where we should consider the arguments on both sides of the debate. And so I'd like to present a lot of the case for what I consider to be the better arguments for what would be considered a pro-life position.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, Doug. So you're arguing for a pro-life position. I mean, obviously recognizing too that we define as Christians, right? We define our morality from God, right? God gives us morality. He's the definer of morality. And so I guess the place we should start, right, is as Christians, and assuming most of the folks that are watching along with us right now are Christians, we should start with the Bible, no?
Yeah, I think so. So not the place to start, as with a lot of justice issues and issues of equality and things like that, would of course be Genesis chapter 1, where all human beings are created in the image of God. That's Genesis 1:26 and 27. And of course, the reason why that's important is because that is, from a biblical standpoint, what confers on every single human being an equal degree of worth and an equal degree of dignity. And so both in terms of logic and in terms of biblical logic, that in fact is what makes the taking of innocent life wrong. So one of the first times you really have that issue addressed, it's implicit in the Cain and Abel story, but later on in Genesis chapter 9, when God is making a covenant with Noah, one of the things that is said there is, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And that's Genesis 9:6. So what's important there is you see that the reason why the taking of innocent human life is wrong from a biblical standpoint is because all human beings bear the image of God. At the very least, any issue, whether it be war, whether it be, killing in any sense, should be a very morally serious issue for us. And so it's then we move on from that, and we note that abortion is the taking of innocent human life, and we will establish that as we go on in our conversation.
Yeah, that was another thing I wanted to ask you, Doug. I mean, I don't know if you want to belay it or maybe, kind of attack this now, right? But the question, like, if I'm listening along and if I wasn't pro-life, probably the first thing I'd be challenging is the definition of life, right? Because there's a counter argument that says that, at what point does a fetus or an embryo become a fetus, or a fetus become a child? At what point does it become human life, right?
Yes.
And so there's a counter argument that's there. I don't know if you want to should we answer that now, do you think, Doug?
Let's get to that in about a minute or so, because I think that is important. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, we definitely
at least argue that there's an argument to be made that children as humans are made in the image of God.
Yeah. The basic argument is that all human beings are made in the image of God. Therefore, all human beings' life is valuable. Abortion is the taking of innocent human life. Therefore, abortion is wrong. Or you could phrase it, the taking of innocent human life is wrong. Abortion is the taking of innocent human life. Therefore, abortion is wrong. Now, if those things are true, I think that's a very sound argument. And so if those things are true, if abortion is the taking of innocent human life, then and the taking of innocent human life is wrong, then abortion is wrong. That's the essential argument. I think the interesting thing to note there as well is that is an argument that should not just appeal to Christians. So all that now, I think talking about the image of God is important, but all that does to the argument, and it is significant, of course, right, is it increases the dignity of human beings.
Right.
So, if you have an atheist still believes that human life is valuable, presumably. It's just that the Christian has every reason for thinking it's more valuable, because we also believe that human beings are made in the image of God.
Right.
So the entire thing, you could simply start from the premise: the taking of innocent human life is wrong. Abortion is the taking of innocent human life. Therefore, abortion is wrong. This is, I think, the proper way to frame the debate. And I don't mean to make short shrift of the counter argument, but the counter point, right, those who would want to make a pro-choice argument would be that a woman has a right to choose to do what with what she wants with her own body. And with all respect, obviously I agree with that. I'm the father of four daughters, and I love my wife, and I greatly respect the dignity of all women. But the fact of the matter is that our rights are limited, are not absolute. So any right that we argue that we might have is called into question or curtailed when the exercise of that right involves the violation of another person's right. So I have the right to do what I want with my body, okay, but I can't go and commit a crime against another person, whether it's an assault or something like that, and argue, well, I have the right to do what I want with my own body. Now that does get a little bit, there are some other angles on that we will explore, okay, such as, do I have the obligation to care for someone with my body, which would be a better way of framing that. But the simple fact that a woman has a right to choose that presupposes that we're ignoring the fact that the abortion is a taking of innocent human life. Because I don't think anyone would say, I have the right to do what I want with my own body, therefore I have the right to take innocent human life. You see how the real moral question here is that whether or not it's the taking of innocent human life.
Right. Yeah, that was the question I was alluding to earlier, right? Because
So
I like your for those that are kind of caught it, you've given us a logical statement, right? You've given us a piece of logic with an A, B, and therefore, right? So A, taking of human life is wrong. B, abortion is the taking of human life. So therefore, C, essentially, abortion is wrong.
And I would emphasize innocent.
Innocent.
But you're right. You're correct. I'm just saying that's another thing that adds a little bit more weight to it. But
sure.
So the question is, and again, we will circle back to the right of a woman to choose what to do with her body, because I think if we rephrase that as, am I obligated to use my body to sustain someone else's life? Then you have a more interesting moral question, of course, right? So like if you got super sick, Alex, and I had some rare property in my blood that would keep you alive, am I morally obligated to give you my blood? Especially if it like inconveniences me for 9 months to do so. You know what I'm saying? Like I think the argument for choice is stronger when we look at it that way, but that too, I think fails. And we'll discuss the reasons why.
That's interesting, because by similar logic in that would have a lot of other implications for coronavirus too. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. But let's stick to the notes here, because I do want to come back to these two questions we've just.
We're not going to go all C-19 on everyone. Okay, so the question is the unborn child a human life? The interesting thing about this, I think, or one of the interesting things, is that there's not a lot of widespread disagreement in the actual literature on the ethics of abortion on this. In other words, it is widely acknowledged, I don't mean to just make a blanket appeal to authority, that any human being at any stage of development is a human life. So in other words, that goes from a one-cell organism all the way to the 100-year-old man. It's a human life. And so what do we mean? So first, the question life. Okay, so even if you're talking about a single cell, a zygote, a fertilized cell, clearly it is a life. Okay, it has all the properties of a living organism. It metabolizes energy. It regulates its own internal environment, and all the other things you can Google what makes a life a life. Clearly a zygote has that. And clearly a zygote is human. Okay, so clearly a one-celled fertilized egg is also human. It has all of the genetic structure is clearly human. It will never be anything but human. Okay, so it is a human life. And further, I would also add, it is also not a organ in the woman's body. It's not a part of the woman's body. Unlike all the other cells in her body, it has its own distinct genetic code. Notice this is a scientific argument too.
Yeah.
This is not me saying I have a Bible verse that says life begins at conception. This is again is a scientific argument. In fact, if I could just quote one source, this is Micheline Matthews Roth from Harvard Medical School testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. It is scientifically correct to say that an individual human life begins at conception when egg and sperm join to form the zygote, and this developing human always is a member of our species in all stages of its life. So this is basic biology. It's fairly uncontested that it is a human life. Now, I will also add at this point that we are talking, I have been framing this as conception, as the moment of conception, as zygote, right? But the fact of the matter is that I don't think you even need that in order to make a strong argument against abortion. You only need that to make a strong argument against some abortion. Okay, because the fact of the matter is that, as we all know, a child in the mother's womb does not remain a zygote very long. It begins to multiply and to grow, right? And our laws in our country allow the killing of that human being any time during that. So even if we had a problem with arguing that a zygote is a human life, which again is not scientifically controversial, but if you wanted to be contrarian, then fine. What do we say then of abortion after a certain point? Are you opposed to it then? Because I think it was Ron Paul on The View I saw a while back, right, arguing it, and he's like, well, when do you think life begins? And they're like, well, I think they said at the stage of viability, right? It can survive outside of the womb, or I should say, he or she can survive outside of the. Well, okay, but here's the thing: it's still legal to kill a child beyond that point. So, why are we not advocating justice beyond that point? You know what I'm saying? So, like, even saying I'm pro-choice and therefore a woman should have the choice to kill a child at any point during the pregnancy is still, I think, a morally incorrect view to hold. Okay, if that makes sense. So again, we're like, okay, even if you do, so the point would be, okay, even if you don't think a zygote is a human being deserving of life, of rights, what do you say about further stages of development? Now, one thing that I mentioned is this issue of viability, because that is a common criteria. So some people will say, okay, once a child reaches the point of viability, that is that it can survive outside of the womb, then we should regard that as a point. Now, again, my point that I just said still stands, that it is still legal to take that child's life after the point of viability. So if you think that, then you should be an anti-abortionist after the point of viability. That's your correct moral position. Otherwise, then you believe that murder should be allowed. Okay? If you think that abortion is wrong after that point. So, but there's not a whole lot of, pro-choice individuals who hold that and who vote in that way, or, do activism in that way.
Sure.
But I also want to say that I think viability too is a poor standard and rather arbitrary standard.
Doug, what point, so help me understand the counter argument. At what point do they consider the point of viability? I mean, is that?
The point of viability currently, as I understand it, is 20 weeks.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And this is when the child can survive outside the mother's womb. And so, but again, I think that is a somewhat bad, an arbitrary criterion anyway, for two reasons. The first reason is that independent. I think it's fallacious to say that that independence confers dignity or value. So if I am, in other words, my abilities to sustain my life on my own is what gives me my right to life. Right? Like if I'm in a car accident and I'm in need of the paramedics to sustain my life until I get to the hospital, it would be morally wrong for the paramedics to say, "I'll just screw it" on the way there, right?
Yeah. I mean, none of this makes any sense. Like, if you think about it, all right, even if you're past the point of viability, it can survive outside of the womb, but it's still a baby. You know what I mean? It still needs to be fed. It still needs to be cared for. It won't survive without help. You know what I mean?
And by the way, as all babies do.
Yeah.
So in other words, so the idea that a child can live independently outside the mother, the question is, so what's the criterion? Is it independence? Because that doesn't work. That's what I'm saying, is that ability to live independently doesn't work, because even infants cannot live independently.
Right. That's right. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
The other problem with this is that if that is what confers a right to life, then your right to life, a person's right to life, changes depending on how advanced medical technology is. So in the early 1900s, viability was not 20 weeks, it was 30 weeks, because the child didn't have a good chance of living outside the womb until 20 weeks. So so in 1900, in order to be a human person with human rights, you have to be 30 weeks old. But in 2000, it's magically you have those rights if you're 20 weeks old. You see what I'm saying? So it seems to be a very arbitrary and morally fraught criteria to say that viability is what confers a right to life.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so a lot of this conversation, therefore, circles around. So, as I've said, most people who write on this topic acknowledge that any human being at any stage of development, or whatever stage we want to talk about, is a human being. And so the question actually often revolves around personhood, or some people will frame it that way.
Okay.
So this is a human being, but it is not a person. In other words, a person is someone who is entitled to rights under the law.
Okay.
Okay. That would be the legal definition of a person. Obviously, the theological definition is going to change a little bit, right? We believe God is three persons, right?
Yeah.
But this is when we're talking about like legal distinctions, that would be the thing. And I think as Christians, we should be quite disturbed as that. And by any morally serious person, if we're morally serious at all, we should be very disturbed by the issue of there being a difference between a human being and a person.
Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense. You know, right. It's funny because even in the midst of, like, I was kind of talking with you, Doug, beforehand. I'm like, I feel wholly inadequate to be able to add anything of substantive value to this conversation. But like, none of this makes any sense to me. You know what I mean? Especially the legal implications of that as well, because legally you can have abortions, and we're arguing about personhood. We're arguing about viability. We're arguing about, life. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But then at the same time, it's like, it's illegal to commit suicide. And even by the same kind of terms, right? Like you can kill yourself, right. But still we've got laws against that. Yeah. And yet, or want to get help or anything else. And at the same time, that's the definition, right? You're not affecting anyone else.
Well, the law is inconsistent all over the place on this. Yeah. There's one thing that's recently come into view because of change. I think it was the New York State, right? Like, so if someone murders a woman who is pregnant, he can be charged with 2 counts of murder.
Yeah.
Right. So the child is a legal person under those circumstances, but under a circumstance, if the mother and a doctor conspire to end a child's life, then it doesn't have a right, legal rights.
Yeah. So you probably, it's an easy argument to say that simply because something is legal does not necessarily make it.
We better all believe that. Yeah. Yeah, and the examples abound. One time slavery was quite legal in the United States, and that was not. Yeah, clearly something being legal does not make it moral.
Sure.
So now this issue of personhood, this was, by the way, something that was acknowledged in Roe versus Wade itself. So on page 157 through 158 of the decision, Justice Blackmun, who wrote the decision, wrote this: if the suggestion of personhood is established, the appellant's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus's right to life is then guaranteed specifically by the amendment, by which he meant the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
So in other words, if the fetus's personhood is established, then its right to life under American law is established and it cannot be killed.
Okay. So if the personhood is established, it's protected under the American law, cannot be killed. So now the point in question is, how are we establishing personhood, right? How
do you establish personhood? Yeah. And so, I would just say one thing that I always point out with this is that the attempt to distinguish human beings from persons, say which human beings are persons, has a quite disturbing history. These are distinctions that were drawn by the Nazis regarding Jewish people.
Yep.
These were the distinctions drawn between the United States and the British Empire regarding blacks during slavery. These are the distinctions that Europeans made between for Native Americans, the Hutus in Rwanda to the Tutsis. So this is a common tactic of oppressive injustices that we all decry as evil,
right.
To deny human rights to human beings. And so as soon as we enter into this field, we should understand that we're essentially saying those guys were wrong in doing it, but for some reason it's right to do this in this case.
Right.
That is essentially what we're doing. This is the legal reason. And so the simple point that I would make is that I don't think, and this is kind of cutting to the quick and fast of the argument, but I don't think there's any argument for abortion based on personhood that does not, first of all, also justify infanticide, because, you would have things like being able to be self-determined or capable of having emotions and things like this, right? You have different lists of people who have attempted to define personhood, and it's always like, oh, surprise, surprise, unborn children just happen to not be persons. Then what a coincidence that the argument that you're purposely trying to build in order to justify abortion leaves unborn children out of personhood. But then also I would just simply say that there's no argument for abortion based on personhood that's not arbitrary. There is no real arbitrary way to say it, to make the argument. There's the only non-arbitrary standard is all human beings are persons.
Okay.
And if that's the case, as I said, we've already established that unborn children are human lives. And if we're going to be morally consistent, we say all human life deserves personhood, deserves human rights. In fact, the whole case of human rights is basically a sham if we say there are some humans who don't have them.
Right.
Then they're not human rights.
Right.
Yeah.
And obviously as Christians, we hold that every human has infinite value, worth, and dignity, because again, the doctrine of the Imago Dei that we were talking about in the beginning, we've been made in the image of God, right? In God's image, male and female,
Yeah. God created them. And so, but now let's say that you're like, oh, well, that's all interesting stuff, but I don't know about that. I don't know. I don't know. Seems like personhood maybe starts somewhere during the pregnancy or I don't know. I don't know how to make this decision. Well, to those people, I would say you are if that's your position, then I would say you're morally obligated to be against abortion.
Why? Because
in life, especially in life or death situations, I don't know is not an acceptable standard for choosing death. Right. anyone who is agnostic about when life begins or at what point a child becomes a person has a moral obligation to choose life. And examples are easily cited. So like one that I frequently use is if you're driving down a highway and you see a stroller in the middle of the lane, you're morally obligated to avoid that at all costs, even if that means driving into a guardrail, right? But the stroller was facing away from me, and I didn't know whether there was a life in it or not, right? I think we would all say that's the correct decision to make. Another one that I've used before, and these are not just esoteric. I mean, this is basically any scenario you could come up with. But like, let's say, for example, that there's a murder and someone's DNA is found at the crime scene, and they're convicted of the murder, but then it's found that this individual has a twin who has identical DNA. Well, then it's morally wrong to kill, to mete out the death penalty to this person on the basis of DNA evidence. So again, if you're not sure about personhood, if you're not sure about, then your position should be, let's not kill. We are morally obligated to preserve this life.
Sure. So if I hear what you're saying, then Doug, because I'm somewhat confused about the difference between human versus person. You know what I mean? In my mind,
because there isn't
one the same.
There isn't one.
Okay. So I guess, so then your argument really is you're addressing some of the issues that are often thrown forward by pro-choice, right? Mm-hmm. In the sense that saying, well, there's a difference between humanity and personhood. And you're kind of walking that trail of saying, well, even if that were so, you know what I mean? Then you would be morally obligated toward being against abortion and the reasons, right? If I'm following you along, following that kind of path, because to simply say, well, I'm not sure, and then just be ignorant to the fact is essentially choosing death. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's and a lot of death too. It's not like there's only a few abortions in our country every year.
Right. It's ironic to me. Every time this issue comes up, there's always an example that's given. Well, what if a woman is beaten and raped and she ends up becoming pregnant? Right?
Yeah. And that's tough. That's a tough one to address as a guy.
Of course.
Like,
yeah.
I have had things happen to me in my past that make me somewhat sympathetic to a woman who's violated. But I was not pregnant as a result. I can't say. But what I can say about about those issues is, first of all, even if you're compelled that abortion in the case of rape is morally permissible, those aren't the laws in our country.
Right.
Our laws in the country do not say abortion is only permissible under rape and a few others. No, it's you can have one for any purpose.
Right.
Particularly because Doe versus Bolton in 1973 defined the health of a mother as everything from financial to emotional health. Right. So effectively, any reason a woman gives, anything from hardship to just convenience is acceptable. So
the other thing with that too, even if we do get the extreme example, of all the abortions that are happening year after year, how many of those are really these extreme cases? You know what I mean?
Well, and there actually are statistics in terms of reasons that are given, and I grant that there's probably some a degree of error here, but the number that I've seen, and anyone can look this up I'm not saying but just the number that I recall is that there are approximately, out of the reasons that are given for abortion, there are approximately 32,000 every year in the United States that are given. However, I'm sorry. No, that's incorrect. The figure I've seen is 32,000 for rapes resulting in pregnancy. Okay, so 32,000. Of those, approximately 75% of those women elect to keep their babies. So out of all the abortions in our country every year, and I didn't look for this conversation, but it's hovering, if I recall correctly, somewhere around 500,000 to around 600,000. But even, a fraction of that is too much. But at any rate, that's about 8. That means there's about, if those figures are correct, then somewhere around 8,000 in our country, children are aborted for the purpose of race. That can be the case as well. If you can look at the racial disparities as well. It's much more common in minority communities than it is in white communities. So there is a racial aspect of this, but it's much, so somewhere around 8,000 in our country every year for the purpose of rape. Okay. And if that's the case, that's somewhere between 1% and 2% of all abortions. And but that's not really what we're operating off of. Because first of all, we would want to say that hard cases generally make bad rules. A much better way to think morally about a subject is what is right and wrong. And once we've decided that, then we incorporate exceptions.
Sure.
Okay. Although, and then again, I would also add that the laws in our country do not restrict abortion to these hard cases. It's for any case a woman wants.
Right.
So that is still an unjust law. And then I would also say that there is a moral case that even in the case of rape, it is a morally wrong decision to make. And that is made by women as well as men who are pro-life. So this is not like some kind of sexist patriarchal thing that I'm saying. It's just simply to point out, that that there is a moral case to be made for that. But I would leave that to survivors of abortion attempts or women who have been in this circumstance, and their testimonies are available and out there. So I would leave it to them to make those arguments with those considerations in mind. The other thing that we would want to say too, that I'd want to say too regarding hard cases, is that virtually, I'm sure there are people out there that say abortion in any instance should be outlawed, but I'm not aware of any. Like, I think, because you can always find people who make kook arguments. Most people who are pro-life, who are serious thinkers, by which I mean like they write and they publish and they interact with people of other views, do not argue that abortion should never be legal. Because and one glaring example is when the life or health of the mother is seriously threatened, the physical health. Right. So examples to this would be something like an ectopic pregnancy, where the child implants in the fallopian tubes, in which case both the mother and the child would die if the pregnancy is continued. And there are other circumstances in which continuing a pregnancy seriously threatens the life of the mother, in which case, there's I think a just law would have provision for things like that. The problem is that health of the mother is far too broadly defined in our society, and allows it for, if basically as if you wanted to use abortion as backup contraceptive, that's fine. So our laws were when we point out.
So the laws are so broad that they allow you to essentially say anything that you want, that you could look at abortion as a contraceptive and say, well, we choose abortion because we don't have the financial capabilities, or I don't have the mental ability to be able to handle this right now, or else, and just call that in every other case, if you heard that we had some law in our country that was allowing the death of thousands upon thousands of people every year, you would oppose it and you would be livid about that law, and rightfully so. And so even if you only wanted to consider later term abortions for elective reasons, okay, though that's legal in our country, the law still should be changed. So even if you're not coming down as strongly pro-life as perhaps I am, then that doesn't mean that the only other option is legal at any time for any cause. Right.
The other thing that I want to mention too, and this comes back to what I was saying about a woman's right to choose. I said that there are better ways to frame that, and particularly one that, yes, I do not have the right to murder someone and argue that I'm doing what I want with my own body. But on the other hand, do I have a moral obligation to lend my body or parts of my body and significant parts of my life to care for another person? Is there a moral obligation on me for that? So the example I gave was, you need my blood for some reason. Am I morally obviously we would think that is a super erogatory good thing, like something that I'm not obligated, but it's still good for me to do. And I'm going beyond my moral obligation and it's a good, but should I be legally required to do that? And of course, analogies are given. There's a famous one called the famous violinist, where you wake up in a hotel room and you're hooked up to this violinist and you're told he's going to die if you're not hooked up to him for the next 9 months or something like this. Do you? But I think most of those analogies leave out a very key difference. And that is that in all those cases, it is not the donor's, let's say, fault that this other person is dependent upon them. Okay, so in the situation where you're sick and you need my blood, that's just happenstance. But if I did something to you that caused you to need my blood, then my moral obligation to you increases.
Sure.
Okay.
So in this example, if I was sick, I would be sick regardless of whether or not I even knew you.
Right. But in an actually analogous case, it would be like the result of me doing something that made you sick.
Right.
Okay. And so
as a moral obligation goes.
Yeah. And so to move out of the weird realm of analogy, when I engage in recreational activity that is risky, that bears some kind of risk, I am liable for that. Okay. If I go out tonight and drink, I'm liable if I crash my car into someone on the way home. If I'm playing baseball in my yard and I hit my ball through my neighbor's window, I am liable to fix that because I engaged in something recreational and someone else was affected by that. Okay. Now, people don't like to hear this, but when we engage in voluntary sex, there is an assumption of risk. This is the entire insurance industry is based on assumption of risk, right?
Right.
You do something and there's might be a small chance, but there's a chance that something might happen. And it's your obligation to care for that if it does. And so if I want to engage, there is an implicit assumption of risk that if I have sex, a life may be created. Mm. And in that case, I do have a moral obligation towards that life. Right. And the other thing that I think I always want to add on to this is what kind of people do we really want to be? This isn't so much an argument for how the laws should be, because I don't necessarily think that there should be laws that force us to be good people, but more on a personal level, I would just say that even if you think I don't have an obligation or I have a legal right to not care for someone, I think it's still our responsibility as humans and certainly as Christians to care for others. And to say, I'm going to act brave for someone else's good, or I'm going to inconvenience myself or put myself through a hardship for someone else's good. And that's more of a moral appeal that I would just make to people that, I think that's the case. And so we should be challenged about that. And related to that is the fact that I think we should all acknowledge that it needs to be acknowledged that becoming pregnant. One more thing on assumption of risk before I hop off of that.
You finish your sentence, Doug?
I would say that anyone who disagrees with the assumption of risk argument would also need, if they're going to be consistent, to disagree with child support. So child support laws are based off of the assumption that having sex is the assumption of risk and that you're responsible for the outcome of it. Even if the man doesn't want the child, tries to encourage his girlfriend to get an abortion, but if she says, no, I want this child, then that man is legally obligated, at least until the child is 18 and maybe longer, to financially care for that child, to provide for that child. So there's another legal inconsistency.
Of many. Yeah.
So the other thing that I was about to mention before my ADD got the better of me was that the responsibility to that is incurred when a woman has sex, or when a couple has sex, because there's a responsibility on both people, right? Is I think, to bear the child and perhaps to raise the child. But we live in a culture in which there are other options than that. Mm. So, my wife, I have 4 children, 3 of whom are adopted. Okay. My wife and I, especially my wife, are active advocates in the adoption community, and support families, have helped families get linked up with, adoptive children. And we've taught, or my wife has taught classes for the fostering certification and things like that. And there is no lack of couples who would love to adopt infants. Mm. But when a couple does, and I'm good friends with a couple who just adopted an infant, it's like a long process to even find a child that's available. Like, there are many couples who would jump at the opportunity to adopt a child with no strings attached. A newborn infant. There is no shortage of that. And anyone who doubts that or wants to dispute that in any way, I would just say that my experience for years now, we've been in the adoption community for 6 years now, runs completely contrary to that. There is, as far as I know, and this is somewhat anecdotal, no shortage of adoptive parents, especially for infants. And so, and I think that touches on the Christian's obligation. Ever since the years of the early church, Christians were noted for their care for orphans. And one example that is cited sometimes is how unwanted children, many times female, but a lot of times male as well, or disfigured children, were often left to just die of exposure in the Roman Empire. And the Christians were known for going to those garbage heaps and taking those children and making them their own. And I know that a lot of us as Christians feel very compelled to have a moral voice about this. And to an extent, like, I'm not saying like you have to adopt children if you're going to be able to speak morally credibly on abortion, right? Like, anyone in 1800 would have been morally correct to have opposed slavery, even if you yourself were not, part of the Underground Railroad or something like that, right? You're still correct about it. But I would say that, that I think, I would encourage all my brothers and sisters in Christ to be extremely supportive of the adoption community. And, one decision that my wife and I made, and we make a lot of stupid decisions. I am far from perfect. I share an office with you, and that better than all people. But I will say that, we didn't adopt because we couldn't have other biological children. Right. We adopted because there were children out there who needed a home. Yeah. And so we decided not to have more. I obviously don't think it's immoral to have biological children, right. But if you have the ability, then I would encourage my brothers and sisters in Christ to seriously consider adoption. And we've all been the beneficiaries of adoption because the Lord says that he has adopted us into his family. And then the other thing I would also say that the obligation of the Christian is to care for both women who have had abortions and who are thinking of having abortions. Single mothers should be embraced and supported in every way that we possibly can in the church. And women who have been in the position where they have decided to do this in the past should be welcomed through the grace of Christ and not judged any more than our own evil should be held against us. There is equal grace at the foot of the cross. The ground at the foot of the cross is level, as Billy Graham said. So, those are all things. So I think that, like, as Christians, the real powerful issue is not only like trying to win debates about this and not only trying to vote in the right direction with this, but it's also, if not even more so, actually doing something about it and opening up our homes and our lives to children who need homes, to mothers who are single and are having a hard time raising their kid on their own because they've made that good decision, as well as women who, for one reason or another in the past, have undergone this procedure. The arms of God are wide open to all those people, and therefore so should our arms be.
Yeah, well said, Doug. If you guys are listening to this too, and you're kind of in a difficult position, or if Doug and I kind of talking through this is stirring up some mixed feelings about you, please feel free to reach out to us. We partner with some pretty amazing ministries that are on the front lines of this issue, and counselors and mentors. And I'm sure Doug and myself would also be more than happy to chat. If there's some other things that you guys are trying to work through, we'd be more than happy to talk as well. Doug, thank you so much for your time this week and for your preparation. This was an interesting Theology Thursday for us, because a lot of this came down to scientific and logical arguments. Just because it's simply the biblical argument is established, you know what I mean? As you said, in some ways, and you open up the first pages of your Bible and it's established there, as a Christian argument, as a biblical argument. But this one in particular there's moral arguments, there's legal arguments, there's logical arguments that are to be made as well. And so, and that does relate. If I could I know we're wrapping up there, but I could just say that, like, that does very much relate to the way this is sometimes framed in public discourse, that the only reason people think this way is because of religious convictions, and those who want to, affect our society's laws for the better are doing so because they're religiously motivated. And to that, we would say that, first off, the initial moral opposition to slavery was also for religious convictions. But I would also say to note that you can make a strong biblical case for this, as I feel that we did. I mean, I'm not sure how else we're supposed to biblically reason about this, but I did want to also, I think you're correct in saying that even if a person didn't even believe in God, I think most of the arguments still maintain. So there is a strong biblical argument, but also a strong secular argument for it as well. They stand on their own. Yeah. Awesome. Doug, thank you so much. Thank you guys for tuning in this week and checking in with us. We'll look forward to chatting with you soon. Like I said, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and then we'll look forward to seeing you on the next Theology Thursday. Take care. Bye-bye.